All right, so let's get going on today's meeting. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to finish up our special topic on ecological psychology. So last time we had part two. Today we have part three, the finale. And as I mentioned before, ecological psychology has nothing to do with environmental concerns, but everything to do with the environment. And we're going to wrap up our look at it today. But just a reminder of kind of where we were. This idea of ecological psychology was that we started off with the wrong concepts. We were trying to understand perception, and we needed to adopt new concepts specifically for an organism that evolved their perceptual system in an environment. And in that way, in ecological psychology, the environment and the organism are tied up together into kind of one entity. So it's much like a Mobius strip in this case, where your human mind, your perceptual mind, the thing that is doing perception, is not a isolated entity, but it's actually your cognitive abilities tied into the environment, which are actually part of your cognitive abilities. So it's like that one-dimensional Mobius strip where it looks like there might be two sides to it, but it's really just one entity that is driving perception. And then we also saw how motion through the environment contributes to understanding perception and the invariant and perspective structure of the ambient optic array. And today we are going to finish our look at ecological psychology by taking a look at how you theoretically perceive action that you can do in your environment. Again, because one of the basic ideas is that we are organisms in an environment, not disembodied perceptual systems, and therefore we're going to interact with that environment. And one way that we interact with it is through motion, but another way that we interact with it is by interacting with the environment, by grabbing things, by bumping things, by climbing things, by avoiding things. So we're going to see how that information is potentially incorporated in ecological psychology. So that was a kind of brief recap of where we've been. Today we're going to end it with a look at affordances, which again are those action possibilities that are in the environment and are picked up by the organism through perception. So just a real brief kind of secondary recap. So last time we took a look at the ambient optic array, we discovered that there is perspective structure and invariant structure that underlies the ambient optic array. So perspective structure determines the actual shape of the ambient optic array, and then the invariant structure gives you information for things that do not change in your environment. So we saw invariant relations, such as the size of objects on a ground plane can be scaled by the texture of the ground plane. So again, we have this idea of the importance of texture. And if you take away those tiles, solving the problem of how large are those cans relative to each other becomes impossible. But once you have an environment that has texture, like our environment does, all of a sudden that information is there and the problem can be solved. And we took a look at other invariants, such as the invariant of whether you are on a road or off a road. So from your viewpoint, if one side of the road is to the left of the vanishing point and the other edge of the road is to the right of the vanishing point, you are on the road. And that is an invariant relation that is going to be true every single time you're on the road. But if you're off to the side of the road, if you're off the road, then both edges of the road will be to one side of the vantage point. So if you're off to the left side of the road, both edges of the road will be to the right of that vantage point. And we also looked at the horizon ratio relation, which allows you to scale objects in your environment, perceive their size, whether they're determined by how much of them is above the horizon and how much of them is below the horizon. And again, this is an invariant relation that will not change regardless of where that object is in the environment. And then we saw an example of this in a video of individuals walking. And as you can see, that horizon that I've drawn in, which there is enough information in this image to calculate where that horizon is. You'll notice that the amount of a person that is above that horizon versus the amount that is below the horizon does not change as people walk farther away or as people walk closer together. And then one of the last invariants we took a look at was the invariant for identity. And we took a look at caricatures as an extreme example of this, how you can preserve the invariant structure. So in both of these images of Caitlin Clark, the photographer has preserved the perspective structure. That's what a photo does. The caricature artist has not preserved the perspective structure. Parts of Caitlin's face are way too large. Parts of her face are way too small. Parts of her body are way too large. Parts of her body are way too small. But the invariant relation that specifies this individual as an identity has been maintained. And that's why you can take a look at that caricature and say, well, if that person existed in real life, that would be, they would have massive physical problems because their perspective structure is just all wrong. But yeah, that does look like Caitlin Clark. And this caricature does look like Ariana Grande, even though the perspective structure is way out of whack. And then this looks like Pedro Pascal, even though, again, the perspective structure is way out of whack as well. And the idea is that anything that we perceive in this world as unchanging has an invariant structure underlying it. And our job as perceptual psychologists is to discover that invariant structure. So things like identity has an invariant structure across images, but identity also has an invariant structure across time. So if you can recognize somebody when they're older versus when they're younger, so if you see a picture of a friend of yours when they were a little child, and you look at that little child and you go, oh yeah, that's definitely you, that means that the invariant structure that specifies their identity has been maintained from childhood to adulthood. And you can take a look at people as they age or do not age in some cases across time. So we got Keanu Reeves at 27 years old, Keanu Reeves at 35 years old. Keanu Reeves probably, I don't know, it's hard to tell with him, but I would say maybe 20, maybe 18, could be 5, could be 82. I don't know with Keanu Reeves, but there is a definite Keanu Reeves-ness to all of these images. So that if you were shown these images, you would be like, yes, that's the same guy. That's the same person, just at different ages. And if that's the case, that means that the invariant structure that specifies Keanu Reeves' identity does not change as he has aged. If all of a sudden, though, and occasionally you'll see this in Hollywood when people get work done, occasionally that work will break the invariant structure, and you'll take a look at them and say, oh my gosh, I barely recognized this actor or this actress because of the work they had done, and that means that they have broken that identity invariant structure that underlied that constant identity of theirs. All right, so invariants provide this information for perception. This is where your perceptual system picks up the information that things aren't changing. So this, again, is a very different idea than we have hypotheses, or we have theories, or we have assumptions, or we have inferences that things are not changing due to experience with them. It's actually in the environment that there's information that things do not change. And you don't need experience with these objects to learn that humans don't change size as you get closer to them. You just know that immediately because in the environment, that invariant is saying, yeah, this person is not changing size as you get closer to them. So anything that can be perceived that is persistent has an invariant. So we're not going to go through the example today with the BioMotion Lab, but the link is there in the slides, and I'll make it available when I post these online. But basically, and you can fool around with that one to just kind of see how these invariants can be drawn out and then programmed in a computer simulation. But anything that can be perceived as constant over time has an invariant under it. So if you can perceive and group people into different gender categories, that means that there is some underlying structure that underlies the perception of maleness, for example, or femaleness, for example. That means that there's something in common that people who look female or people who look male all have in common that allows you to perceive that invariant structure. If you can tell if somebody is angry and you say to yourself, yeah, I know what an angry person looks like, that means that anger has an invariant structure that you pick up and are able to perceive that. So if John looks angry and Mary looks angry and Jeffrey looks angry, what that means is that they all look the same. They're all containing that same invariant structure, even though one of them might be baring their teeth, even though another one might be just super frowning. There's some invariant structure underlying anger that allows you to perceive that. And if you've ever, also for temperament, if you've ever walked up to somebody and said, hey, you kind of look nervous today, that perception of, for example, nervousness, there's, even when I was talking about it, I kind of shrugged my shoulders a little bit and started, jittering a bit. There's an invariant structure that underlies those things that we are able to perceive, that we perceive across different situations as being the same across different situations. All right, so that's it for invariants. Invariants are all around us. Anything that we perceive as constant, according to ecological psychology, has an invariant that underlies it. And part of the job of ecological psychologists is go out and find these invariants. So people have to discover the horizon ratio relation. People have to discover on the road, off the road relation, the ground plane relation. So that's part of the work that an ecological psychologist would do, is try to discover these invariances. And they've had a lot of success with invariants. But the last thing that we're going to take a look at is one of my favorite ideas in ecological psychology, mostly because it's just it sounds a little wacky, and the terminology for it is even wackier. So let's just get to it. It's affordances. And what an affordance is, this is an action possibility that is latent in the environment. So it's an action possibility that exists in our environment. And this is something that's objectively measurable. So you can actually go out into the environment and measure things and objectively determine their action possibilities. Or you can objectively determine their affordances in an environment. And this is actually also independent of an individual's ability to recognize those possibilities, but it's dependent on the capabilities of the actor. So it doesn't matter if you can recognize the possibility or you can't recognize the action possibility. It's there, it's independent, but it's also dependent on your capabilities as to whether or not you can take advantage of a particular affordance. So it is defined with respect to the actor. And again, this is one of those ways that an environment is tied into a particular person. So an action possibility for somebody in the environment would not be available to somebody else in the environment, depending upon the capabilities that those two people have in common or different. All right, so let's get to some examples. So affordances are going to be a little bit more loosely defined than invariants, because affordances are just a much higher order type of problem than invariants. But we do have some kind of examples of affordances. So let's suppose that a surface is horizontal. So this is something that's objectively measurable, right? You can go out there, you can get a level, you can put it on top of a surface, and you can say, oh, hey, this surface is horizontal. Let's say that it's also flat. Let's say that it's also extended, so it's got length and it's got width. Let's say that it's also rigid. So rigidity is also an invariant that has an invariant relation underlying it. So if you've ever leant on something and it didn't move because it was rigid, that was you perceiving the invariant of rigidity. Now, this invariant does not underlie all rigid things, because you can, for example, think that something's going to hold your weight and then it just collapses underneath you. Or you could think that perceive something as nice and fluffy, and you go to sit down hard on it and you find out, oh, this is not nice and fluffy. But there's invariant relations underneath rigidity that can determine or specify that something is rigid. Anyways, say that it's rigid, it's horizontal, it's flat, it's extended, it's rigid, and it's approximately knee high off the ground. So this is one aspect that is defined with respect to the actor, because my knee high off the ground is going to be different than somebody else's knee high off the ground. But let's say that we have these characteristics of a surface: horizontal, flat, extended, rigid, approximately knee high off the ground. Well, then according to ecological psychology, that object has the affordance of being sit-onable. So something that has these characteristics, and this is the terminology that I love, will be something something-able. So in this case, this object is sit-onable. Because if you take a look at a chair has a surface that is horizontal, it's flat, it's extended, it's rigid, it's approximately knee-high off the ground. So that is sit-onable. And you don't have to be explained how to use a chair. You don't have to be explained when you're a child that, oh yes, you can sit on this, right? You have the ability to sit on this. You might need to learn whether it's socially acceptable to sit on particular chairs, but you don't need to be taught that this is something that you are able to sit on. You immediately perceive that this object is sit-onable. And it doesn't matter if it's a chair, it doesn't matter if it's a block. If you have ever sat on a table, a low table, if you've ever sat on a slab of concrete, you have perceived that that thing in the environment was sit-onable. Now let's say that it's horizontal, it's flat, it's extended, it's rigid, it's approximately knee-high off the ground or less, and it's also repeating. If we have these objectionable, measurable characteristics, then that object has the affordance of being climb-upable. So stairs, horizontal, flat, extended, rigid, approximately knee-high off the ground or less, and they are repeating. So that object is climb-upable. That object is also crawl-upable. So if you ever have a child, you will find them at some point crawling up those stairs, and you do not have to teach them that. You don't have to teach them that they're able to crawl up the stairs. They can perceive that as an affordance, as a action possibility in their environment. So the object is crawl-upable. That object is also sit-onable, so we can sit on stairs. And if you've ever approached stairs with caution, then you understand that that object is also fall-offable. Right? So all of these action potentials are latent in the environment and objectively measurable by what it is, by the characteristics of that object. And I mentioned toddlers before, and I mentioned them, they're a great example because if you ever want to see the affordances that are in a particular environment, just let a toddler loose in that environment and they will find all the affordances possible. So that laptop, you might not think it, but that laptop is slammable and that laptop is hittable. And there we go, slam it down, boom. That laptop is slammable and that couch is climb-upable. And you can see the exasperated mother there wishing, well, I wish you didn't perceive those action possibilities because my life would be a whole lot easier. And yeah, bookcases. We might not think to climb up them, but they are climb-upable. Let a toddler loose in your environment, in your home, and you will see exactly how many action possibilities there are, things that needed to be socialized out of us. So electrical plugs are small things stick-inable, right? You have to teach children, don't do that action possibility because that action possibility is specified, it's perceivable, and it's something that is just a consequence of the way the environment is. Also, couches are right-onable, so are walls. And just, again, all these different action possibilities that we can perceive and need to be taught not to do rather than taught how to perceive those things. All right, so affordances. I love this quote by Gibson. He goes, now just as surfaces are stand-onable and sit-onable, so also are they bump-intoable or get underneathable or climb-onable or fall-offable. Just the anything doable aspect of the affordances is something that we again perceive. So again, if you've ever approached something with caution, you perceive the possible inflicting of painable of that particular object. If you've ever, you know, been looking for a hiding spot, you are looking for things that are get underneathable or cover you upable, right? So these are all action possibilities that we can perceive. And just to kind of put a cap on this, so it goes, the concept of affordance implies that it's not that the environment is important for perception, but the environment is actually part of perception, because affordances are defined with the objective, measurable aspects of the environment. So that would be, well, maybe it's just important for perception, but also that is defined in terms of the action capabilities of the individual. So if you ever go to a environment with a professional rock climber, you might take a look at a wall and say, yeah, that doesn't have the action possibility of climb upable. Because of my capabilities, I can perceive that's not climb upable. But that rock climber might take a look at that and say, no, that is climb upable, and let me show you how. So it's not, again, that you can divorce or separate the environment from the perceiver. The two of them together come together to determine and create perception. All right, so that was the last thing I wanted to cover for ecological psychology. Any questions before we turn to our next and final topic in perception? All right.